Commander Keown's tune had changed considerably from his earlier "I'll be asking the questions" demeanour, as he intently listened to Sheeta's explanation of the events on the GCS 3 weeks ago with an attentive expression, only interrupting her very rarely to ask for some clarifications. All the while, his crew was still handling the process of taking Conglorch's ship into custody after the Salem had arrived at its location. Finally, after Sheeta had finished retelling what felt like years' worth of events, even though they happened over the course of only a few days, the commander cleared his throat, seemingly wanting to start his reply to her elaborations to her side of the story. However, he stopped himself, remaining with an open mouth. He slowly closed it again, looking to the side in thought. Then, with a new burst of vigour, he lifted his hand, taking a deep breath to answer once again. However, as soon as it had kindled, the spark died out again, and he slowly and audibly let the air out of his lung, bringing his hand around to rub across his mouth. Sheeta felt a bead of sweat run down her forehead and nervously twitched her ears as she watched the man seemingly struggle to determine how he should handle the situation. Finally, Commander Keown sighed, lowering his hand again and lowly mumbling, "You're probably aware that all of this sounds pretty hard to believe, aren't you?" Something about his voice told Sheeta that their story was just about crazy enough that he didn't expect they would try to make something like this up to save their skin. "Yes, we are," Sheeta said, feeling her voice drift off as she spoke as the memories of the event resurfaced in full force. Quickly, she shut her eyes tightly and shook out her head, recomposing herself before continuing with more force behind her words. "But you don't have to believe us right now. We have evidence James has personally collected with us. If you let us show it to you, I'm sure it will be 1,000 times more convincing than us trying to persuade you." Keown replied with a sideways nod, while also lifting his shoulder on the same side, forming a fair enough kind of gesture. "Maybe," he said to himself, picking his lips in contemplation. "Although it would of course be easier if you could prove a connection between yourself and the ambassador. After all, anything on those devices could very well be fabricated, if it's in your possession. You're still under very serious accusations, after all. You did basically just admit that you were part of the terror group that attacked the GCS, so what's telling me you didn't also attack the ambassador and stole his belongings?" "With all due respect, sir, how dumb do you think we are?" Conglorch chimed in, narrowing his eyes on Kieran's wide face. Kieran didn't seem to be insulted by the objection, just looking back at the Tanasha side with a pensive expression. Clearly the man had a side he was leaning towards in this debate of possibilities. However, he could not let his personal hunches and feelings influence his decisions. There was most likely a lot on the line for the human military, after all, so what decisions he made now would carry a lot of weight. But Sheeta had an idea that might just sway him even more in their favour. "Listen, you want to bring us to Earth anyway, don't you?" she said, trying to sound as empathetic and patient as possible, even though she wasn't feeling like that at all. "James has a sister there. She knows us. If you can find her, she can attest to the fact that James and us are at least connected. What you do with that information then, I'll leave up to you." Keown's eyes widened ever so slightly at her request. His face was unusually candid for a man of the military, very openly giving away his thought processes. "Funny you would mention that," the commander replied, tilting his head slightly in thought. He was clearly even more torn now, and seemed to be hanging himself up on a tough decision. Then he sighed once more. "I'm going to be honest. I'll need some time to figure this out. If what you're saying is true, this whole thing is way out of my pay grade, so I will make sure to give this matter the attention and contemplation it deserves," he authoritatively announced, straightening himself up to his full, imposing size. "In the meantime, my crew will continue securing your ship, and I expect you to remain cooperative with them. Soon a section of my crew will dock with your vessel, and you will surrender the bridge to them. I trust that will be no problem. Later I will personally talk to you again to let you know what decisions I've reached, and what measure I will take. For the moment, consider yourself in our custody." Sheeta and Conglorch nodded nervously. Right now, they were at the human's mercy, so it would have to come down to if the primates would do the right thing. "Thank you," Conglorch added, causing Keown to also give them a reaffirming nod before cutting the connection and pushing them through to Ensign Short once again. Conglorch turned his head to look at Sheeta. "I will handle the following communications. You make sure that the Raphaelite and the Cyborg are ready for a section of Dancer soldiers docking the ship. Afterwards, you will also be the one greeting said soldiers. I will direct them towards Airlock 2, so wait for them there," the Titan instructed her in no uncertain terms. Sheeta nodded, and immediately turned on the spot to hurry out of the room to find the remaining crew. All things considered, Moore and Curie took the information that they would soon be boarded reasonably well. Of course, the suspect of soon being surrounded by strange, armed Deathworlders wasn't too enticing for anybody, but they were also fully aware that this had been a foreseeable outcome of them barreling into their territory recklessly. Thinking that it would probably be best to not let an armed human run into any surprises on board, intended or not, Shada decided to just take the two along for the greeting, leaving the rest of the ship apart from the bridge empty, should the troop decide to search it. A bit later, as the three stood in front of the airlock's door, waiting for the human's arrival, Shada felt a bit of nervousness rise up inside her. As she tightly clutched her suitcase containing the valuable information, she still had no idea what to expect of a section of human soldiers and would have to remain wary. However, her own state of mind didn't even begin to compare to that of Moore. The old lady looked at the gate wide-eyed, while a strong vibration went through the entire hull of the ship, indicating that something big had made contact. Likely, the humans had just docked. Curie, on the other hand, stared blankly, their emotions an unreadable mask of metal. Shada swallowed her anticipation, as the door announced its opening with a loud hiss, before bursting open and revealing a group of humans clad in the same dark uniforms the ones they had previously talked to were wearing. On the spot, Shada counted about 20, all of whom had their faces obscured by the tinted masks of breath filters that looked like more modern models than the one James had with him, and were carrying large for their size firearms made from black metal with a sleek design. Even though the primate's posture seemed to be relaxed and none of them lifted their weapons, Shada carefully lifted her arms in surrender, showing off that she was unarmed, while letting the suitcase hang loosely around the thumb of her right hand. Even though their faces were obscured, she could see their heads slightly shift as they surveyed the appearance of their new captives, apparently taking a moment to really take in who and what they were dealing with. Finally, one of them separated from the mass of people, stepping forward and building themselves up. "Hello," the person, whose voice now identified them as most likely a human man, greeted loudly. "I'm Lieutenant Jones and I'll be taking command of this here vessel. You all can take your hands down now." As Shada complied and lowered her hands, he then stopped for a moment, making a show of moving his head left to right, exaggeratedly looking at every one of the three for a few seconds, before continuing. "It seems like you've been so kind to already congregate here for us. Makes our life easier. There anyone else on board we should know about?" Shada swallowed once again, feeling unnecessarily nervous considering that she didn't intend on lying to the lieutenant. "Only the captain on the bridge," she replied, taking point as the technical second-in-command of the vessel. Jones nodded his head energetically. Right, he said, before turning his head towards his subordinates and loudly ordering, 11, 14, 17, search the ship. Reports every 5 minutes. Got it?" "Yes, sir," about 12 humans said, briefly taking up respectful positions before quickly stepping away, spreading out through the corridors in groups of 4. Shada looked after them for a moment, before snapping her attention back to their leader. The Lieutenant Jones gave her an acknowledging nod. "You're the second-in-command of this ship, right?" he asked, with a slight tilt of his head. "Temporarily," Shada replied reservedly. "Great," Jones replied loudly and jovially. "Then you could surely bring me and my team to the bridge while your friends here are transported to our vessel for the moment." Shada felt a twinge of panic rise up within her, her eyes widening and ears standing up straight. "I can't do that," she replied hastily. Jones curiously tilted his head to the other side, and realizing how that had sounded, Shada quickly added, "I'll gladly show you the bridge, but I am responsible for these two, so I can't just let them go without me." Some of the leftover masked humans exchanged glances with each other, while Jones seemed to contemplate her words. "Well, it's not like you have a choice," he said in a faintly pensive tone. "But I guess you've been pretty cooperative so far, so we can probably do you that favour. Don't want to be the reason Chivalry's dead, after all, so... Alright, you can go with them. Just point us in the direction of the bridge." Shada took a relieved breath, putting her hand on her heart. However, very hesitantly, Moore now spoke up with her own concerns. "Excuse me," she said carefully, lifting a single claw to gain some more attention, causing the heads of 9 Deathworlders to instantly snap in her directions, making her slightly flinch. Only after a moment of recomposing herself did she continue. Excuse me, but your ship is probably adjusted to Earth's super high gravity, right? Those are conditions my body will not be able to handle." Jones looked back at her for a moment, apparently processing her words for a moment. "Right," he said loudly, a hint of laughter in his voice. "But you don't have to worry about that. Sure, our outer levels are reaching 1G, but our lower levels are down near standard grav, so even you big, plushy pushover will be fine. We'll make sure to get you a room with cushiony gravity and no windows. Don't you worry your pretty head." Quickly, the humans ushered the 3 of them towards one of their docking vessels. The human shuttles seemed a bit unusual, as they were designed to look more like an aircraft than a spacecraft from the outside. Not that there was a specification as to how a spacecraft had to look, but usually not much time, energy or material was wasted on making it aerodynamic, apart from the occasional wing or fin. This shuttle, however, with its flat form and multiple large wings that held actual rudders and stabilizers, looked like it could probably actually fly within an atmosphere. Almost like they just took one of their plane designs, slapped spacefit engines on it, and called it a job well done. They entered it through a large ramp on the back. The inside reminded a lot more of that of a cargo hold somebody had lined with benches on the walls, than of that of a space shuttle meant to transport people. It was very open, very barren, and the cockpit and with it the pilot was completely separated from them, with a sturdy-looking wall. And waiting for them inside the shuttle was yet another team of masked humans clad in black uniforms, staring at them with barely suppressed curiosity as they entered, guided by one of the boarding soldiers, who stopped on top of the ramp instead of entering with them. Their guide yelled something in their native language to the group and waved dismissively, before turning on his heels and hurrying off the ramp and out of the airlock. The amplified voice of one of the soldiers yelled something after him, causing his entire team to erupt into laughter. Shada furrowed her brows while looking at the group. These were supposed to be the rigid soldiers of Earth James had been telling her about? That didn't quite seem to fit. The time after that was a blur in her mind. Apart from briefly checking them for weapons and telling them to strap in broken and heavily accented GU, their new company was behaving distantly, remaining on the other side of the shuttle while clearly talking among themselves, and every now and then pointing towards one of the group of captives. She'd put her hand on the arm of the nervous Moor and quietly whispered encouragements to her, trying to calm the old woman down despite the stressful situation, while Curie interestingly inspected whatever part of the shuttle they could get their eyes on, not seeming bothered by the humans at all. And very shortly after, they were already in the next airlock, being hurried along by just as non-communicative humans, without any time to look around or become aware of where they were on this new ship. The flood of new images and impressions of these, quite frankly, alien surroundings over such a brief amount of time made it hard to remember any single one of them, especially given the stress and excitement that came with their situation, so she just struggled to remember any details of her first time seeing the inside of a proper human ship, as she was locked into a room by herself shortly after having seen everyone else arrive at their holding cell safely. To her surprise, this holding cell was barely distinguishable from a cabin. It was smaller, yes, but that could also be caused by human cabins being smaller in general. It was also missing a terminal, but who knew if humans used those in general? Otherwise, it was just a room, with a bed, a cupboard, and a sectioned-off washing area. Compared to some places she lived in her past, it was almost comfortable. Certainly more so than the holding cells on Dumnia she had seen from the inside. After being left alone with her own thoughts for a while, she was mostly worried about Curie and Moore. Leaving those two alone after just saying how they were her responsibility left her with a bitter taste in her mouth, even if she had no choice in the matter. She knew Curie would most likely be fine, given that these were humans they were talking about, and the soldiers so far had barely given more than a curious glance at the fact that they were a cyborg. Moore was a different story. Shada basically had to tell herself over and over that the old lady would be fine as long as she cooperated, and that she, knowing her, would most certainly cooperate. Soon her worries started to mix with her impatience. So far, her hands had refused to let go of her suitcase, still clutching it tightly. She needed to get this to someone important. The commander had sounded interested, but now that she was this close, this wouldn't let her rest until she finally knew all the information James wanted to get out there to be in good hands. After a while, she started walking up and down the room, both arms wrapped around the suitcase's every exterior, pressing it against her chest, while in her mind playing out what she would say to the commander over and over. "The ambassador is in danger. Here is the info you need. You have to act fast." Over and over. She didn't know for just how long she was pacing, repeating this mantra, until finally something happened again. She could hear someone approaching through the corridor long before they arrived at the door, so she looked into the quite surprised face of a human when she was already waiting for them as the door loudly opened. She didn't say anything, just watching the primate compose themselves. The woman's pale blue eyes finally found Shada's again as she loudly cleared her throat. Shada gave her a once-over, noting especially the strange two-coloured hair that changed its tint at about half its length, and briefly shuddering at the metal rods hanging from her ears, being seemingly pierced straight through them. "The commander wishes to see you," the soldier finally informed her, taking a step back to gesture for Shada that she was now allowed to leave the room and follow her, Please, follow me. She'd immediately made a step out of the room, still clutching her suitcase, to which the soldier hastily stopped her with an outstretched arm. Please only take what you absolutely need, she quickly clarified, as Sheeda looked at her confusedly. Sheeda needed a moment to process that before she snapped out of her excitement and impatience back into reality. Right, sorry, she quickly gave back, walking over towards the bed while rummaging through the suitcase, pulling out James's phone and computer, while carelessly dropping everything else onto the mattress. The soldier gave a quick smile and nodded, while once again gesturing to follow her. For dealing with someone who, from their perspective, was still a presumed terrorist, all of these humans seemed to be utterly relaxed, which had the strange effect of creeping Sheeda out. Shouldn't they be a bit more on edge, or angry, or anything but polite and vaguely curious? In order to not dwell on it too much, Sheeda decided to pay very close attention to the way they were going this time. The metal walls of the hall were painted over in matte colour, and the floor was covered in some sort of polymer, which had a strong grip to it, allowing little to no sliding across it, while still looking like it was a smooth surface. The paint of the walls changed colour at about half of its height, going from a dark green towards the bottom to a light grey towards the top, then mirrored the same grey colour on the floor and ceiling. The doors separating the hallway from the rooms at its side were designed simpler than the ones usually used on communal ships, being made up of less intricate parts and holding a simpler, oblong shape. They were also seemingly controlled with control panels at the wall next to them, instead of relying on voice and gesture controls. After a few minutes of walking, they finally arrived at one of the many nondescript doors that was apparently their goal, because the soldier stopped behind it, slightly stepped aside to block Sheeda from going forward, and gesturing toward the room with one arm. As Sheeda stopped, looking up at the door, the soldier seemingly flipped a switch, allowing the serrated parts that used to be interlocked with each other to glide apart, revealing yet another strange sight to her. She had expected a room for interrogation, and while there certainly could have been that, it didn't quite look the part. The large room was mostly empty, and looked like it hadn't been used much for some time. In fact, while she didn't have any palpable reason for that assumption, Sheeda had a creeping suspicion that the unfittingly small, human-sized table and chairs in its middle had not been there a day, or maybe even an hour prior to her arrival. The camera, fastened on top of a tripod and directed directly at said table, certainly hadn't been. She didn't expect there to be a random empty room around, so this one had probably been cleared out for the occasion. The table itself was nothing of note, apart from also sporting definitive, non-rounded corners on its edge that you wouldn't find on anything manufactured on Dumnia. The chairs were more interesting, featuring padded seating as well as a padded backrest, but no armrests. Also, the backrest was made as one solid piece that directly connected to the seat instead of leaving a hole in between, which made sense once you thought about it. Humans didn't have tails they needed to make room for, after all. Lastly, when she fully entered the room, she could now also see the armed guards that she had only been able to hear previously, since they stood straight in front of the wall on both sides of the door, looking at her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity as she passed them. Please, have a seat, her earlier guide informed her, after she closed the door behind the both of them and quickly hurried after her. The commander will be right with us. With hasty steps, the soldier hurried past Sheeda to sit down in one of the 3 chairs on the side of the table, opposite to the one housing only a single chair that was presumably meant for her. Sheeda took care to not accidentally squeeze her tail in, as she also sat down. The soldier then pulled out something that looked similar to James's phone, only larger, and put it flat onto the table, swiping across it a few times before pushing it to the side, in one of the yet empty seats, and folding her hands, fiddling with her thumbs as she waited quietly. Apart from the device, there were a bottle containing presumably water, 4 glasses, and what Sheeda could only assume to be a microphone on top of the table. At least the phone-like material its upper part was wrapped in suggested as much. After a moment of contemplation, Sheeda decided to also put down James's computer and phone, laying them out leaning next to each other, right in front of her. Seeing this, the soldier in front of her leaned slightly forward to get a better look at their devices. Quietly, she mumbled something to herself that Sheeda didn't understand, probably because it was once again in a different language. Meanwhile, Sheeda's eyes once again got pulled to those unsettling rods in her ears. Didn't that hurt? She wanted to ask about it, but it wasn't the right time for that. Last thing she wanted was to accidentally insult somebody when she wanted them to listen to her, and she could probably wait for Curie to ask as much the first time they would meet her, spare herself the awkwardness. Briefly, she glanced over her shoulders, taking a closer look at the 2 guards once again. The 2 uniformed men immediately took note of this, returning her curious gaze before quickly exchanging evaluating glances with each other. She courteously flicked her ears at the two before returning her gaze forward, leaving those two to wonder for themselves what that could have meant. The same feeling she had with all of the humans, that they had something to say but something was keeping them from speaking up, filled her once again, as she saw the one raised eyebrow on the woman's face once their gazes met for a second. Luckily, they didn't have to spend much longer in that awkward silence, as the heavy footsteps of the commander heralded his arrival, causing Sheeta to turn and look at the door even before it opened, making all the humans in the room glance at it and her confusedly. When the steel finally made way for the dark, wide figure of Keown, one of the guards let out the slightest impressed whistle through his teeth. Of course, the guards immediately stood up straight at attention, before the commander dismissed them with a wave of his hand while hurrying past them. The female soldier in front of Sheeta had also stood up, before Keown greeted her with the exact same gesture as he had with the guards. "Please excuse the wait," he mumbled, once he had reached the table, blowing past Sheeta at a brisk speed. Up close and in person, Keown's stature left a very different impression from when she only saw him on the screen. He wasn't quite as large as he had seemed compared to Ensign Shaw. In fact, the man was a bit shorter than James, but certainly much broader. And each of his movements had a certain physicality about it, giving his presence a certain weight without him having to resort to grand gestures or loud words. This was somehow solidified by his calm demeanour. "It was no trouble, sir," the soldier immediately replied, scooting slightly aside with her chair to give the commander's wide frame more space to sit down himself. As soon as he had done so, she moved her hand over, bringing his attention to the flat device laid out in front of him by briefly tapping it with her fingertips. Keown briefly stroked her hand across his smooth hair, that was still tightly bound in a ponytail. "Right, okay, that all looks good," he mumbled to himself, while apparently examining whatever the soldier had previously done to the thing. Finally, he tapped on it one more time before putting it flat down onto the table once again. "I guess we can start like this then. First of all, hello. We already know each other, but for protocol's sake, I'm going to introduce myself once again. I would ask you to do the same. I am Commander Makana Keown of the United Human Self-Defense Fleet. This next to me is Lieutenant Junior Grade Elvira Jana, also of the UHSDF. Now, you can state your name and any ranks you might have, please." He nodded and made a brief hand gesture in Sheeta's direction, emphasizing that it was now her turn. Sheeta briefly looked at Jana, who looked back at her candidly and swallowed. A whole lot of lieutenants she got to meet today. "My name is Sheeta," she said, suppressing her tenseness with a quick breath and pressing her hands together. "Well, formerly Petty Officer Sheeta of the Galactic Communal Military, but I'm fairly certain that I've most likely been stripped of that rank by now." "Just Sheeta?" Keown asked in a clarifying manner. "Just Sheeta," she replied with a nod. "Miat don't use family names, sir." Keown nodded to himself. "All right," he said, looking like he was trying to bring his mind into order for a second. "In our earlier conversation, you said some interesting things. I know this might sound unnecessary, but I would like you to repeat them once again for the recording. Even though you have just told me earlier, please don't leave out any details." Sheeta did as she was told, running over the entirety of the events once again, this time starting with the explosion in Curious Laboratory, and ending after the screen had gone black after James had shot it. While she explained, she could see Jaina's eyes dart over towards her superior at some key events, apparently trying to gauge his reaction to what he was hearing. But Keown only looked at Sheeta attentively, slightly nodding or looking a bit pensive at parts, after he had heard them for the second time now. Once her retelling was over, the large man immediately started his questioning again. "And that data you've mentioned is stored on those devices in front of you, correct?" "Yes," Sheeta said, trying to muster every bit of certainty she could into her voice. "Mind if I have a look?" the commander asked earnestly, opening his large hand, but not reaching for the devices himself, awaiting her answer. Sheeta immediately wanted to answer in the affirmative, however, her mouth shut tight, and her hands clenched a fist in an unexpected moment of hesitation. She had no choice. She had to trust this man. But could she? The commander, presumably noticing her reaction, reassuringly said, "I understand your concerns. If what you're saying is true, you put quite a bit on the line to get that data to safety, and risking it now is certainly frightening. But I guarantee you, everything we are doing here is recorded, and great lengths have been taken so that it cannot be tampered with. If anything happens to those devices or the data stored therein, it will cause a great investigation, and certainly put a similar weight into your words, as the information itself would." His words didn't ease Sheeta's mind. He could say whatever he wanted to, after all. But again, she had no choice. Wordlessly, she unclenched one of her fists and pushed the devices over towards the commander with the tips of her fingers. Kyoun first picked up the phone, pressing on its surface with his meaty fingers, and looking surprised as the screen actually illuminated for him. "Oh, it's unlocked?" he wondered out loud, while Jaina leaned over to also have a look. "James removed its lock so I could use it," she did clarify for him, making the large man briefly glance up at her before bringing his attention back down to the screen. "I see," he said, briefly swiping a bit across the screen before adding, "You wouldn't happen to know where he saved said information as well, would you?" Shida could only troubledly shake her head. Kyoun gave a brief smile. "Well, no matter," he said, handing the device off to his subordinate, who hastily got to work searching for it with quick fingers. "If it's on there, we'll find it." He then also pushed over the computer, without even looking at it himself, trusting Jaina would coax any information it held out of it, while he continued talking to Shida. Turning towards her and folding his hands on the table, he said, "Well, those at least certainly appear to be Ambassador Allwyn's devices. If they actually are, only time will tell, but this is certainly enough to get at least my attention. Now I have to determine if it is also worth that of my superiors. So, I'll ask you once again, did Ambassador Allwyn really personally entrust these to you?" "That's what I've been telling you," Shida replied in a quick outburst, from which she quickly settled down again. Kyoun seemed understanding of her demeanour and nodded. "You've mentioned the Ambassador's sister earlier," he said calmly, and held out an open palm invitingly. "To save us some time, would you happen to know her name as well?" Shida's ears stood up straight. Did that question mean they would actually look for her? It had to, right? That meant they were actually getting somewhere. "Yes, her name is Nia," she replied eagerly, sitting up straight in her chair. However, she then got contemplative for a moment, sinking back down as she realised something and added, "Oh, but not Nia Allwyn, and she's not actually his sister. I mean, she is his sister as far as he and I are concerned, but she's not actually biologically his sister, and neither is she adopted. That's why they don't share a last name. But if you ask his family, they'll definitely know about her. For example, his uncle Flint that raised James, he'll definitely know her, or even his mother, but I don't know her name, although she'd probably be an Allwyn too, wouldn't she?" "Actually, she isn't, and neither is Flynn," Kyoun corrected her with a soft chuckle, making Shida immediately shut up, her rambling dumbfoundedly. "And Nia's last name is Subria. But the other stuff was correct, so I'll let it slide." "How do you—" Shida started, but Kyoun was quick to end her sentence for her. "Know that?" he said, with a knowing smile on his face. "Well, I just happen to know some of Mr. Allwyn's family. In fact, I recently had the pleasure of getting to know his sister personally. A lovely woman, really. From your retellings, I take it that you've had that pleasure yourself?" He raised his eyebrows at Shida, his wrinkly face looking at her inquisitively. "Yes," Shida said, sinking into her chair and deflating a bit as the man's words sank in. Was this why he had such a reaction to James's name earlier? She had assumed he had just recognised the name of a semi-famous human ambassador. "It was only briefly and just over a video call, but I did meet her back in the GES." Kyoun pursed his lips, studying Shida's next reactions intently. "Well, a sight like yours, she certainly wouldn't forget, wouldn't you say?" he asked backhandedly. "Especially if her brother himself introduced you." Shida narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "I don't think her memory is that bad," she gave back, not knowing what else to say. Apparently deciding that he had been stalking a corpse for long enough now, Kyoun shrugged and then lifted his head, loudly ordering, "Shipman, please bring in Miss Subria now." One of the guards snapped to attention, loudly replying, "Yes, sir," before turning to open the door and briefly stepping out, returning with the first non-uniformed human Shida had seen since James. A young woman with a familiar dark face and intricately woven hair, wearing a bright white button-up top and the loose, knee-long blank skirt, entered the room behind the ensign, looking around in a bit of confusion. The wooden frame of her chair loudly clattered on the floor, as Shida knocked it over, standing up too fast. "Nia!" she loudly exclaimed, looking at James's sister, who had just unexpectedly entered the room. Behind her, Kyoun leaned forward, expectantly awaiting the woman's reaction to the off-order. "Hey, wait, Shida?" Nia blurted out, apparently taking a second to completely comprehend the feline standing right in front of her, before her face suddenly lit up in realization, as she hastily rushed forward towards the unexpected encounter. Shida also burst, almost leaped in Nia's direction, almost causing the guards to rush in, had Kyoun not preemptively lifted his large hand to stop them dead in their tracks. "What are you doing here?" the two women asked each other, almost at the same time, followed by a wild clutter of words as they spoke over each other, trying to explain their respective situations. They were only stopped by the loud clapping of two large hands, as Kieran had stood up, loudly asking the two to calm down. "So, I see once again you've told us the truth," he loudly said, now earnestly smiling at Shada. "Please, you two, sit down. Nia, I know this all might be surprising, but this matter also concerns you, so please join us for a bit while we figure out what to do." Only now, looking back at the table, did Shada realise that she had failed to wonder just who the last empty chair had been meant for, and now that unasked question had been answered for her. Nia looked at Kieran unsurely and then glanced at Shada, who could only look back at her apologetically and compassionately. This would likely not be easy for her. Still, Shada was glad she was here. If there was anyone that James would consider to be one of the right people, his sister would certainly fit the mould, or at least knew someone else who did. Shada walked to the table alongside her, before carefully picking up the chair she had knocked over while Nia took her place next to the commander, still looking at the large man concernedly. "Does this mean I'll have to explain the whole thing again?" she'd asked, slowly getting exhausted from retelling the strongly draining story time and time again. Kieran smiled at her reassuringly. "We'll just stick to the important bits this time," he suggested in a soft voice, "and this time you'll have the two of us to pitch in as well." He gestured towards himself and Jaina, who was still working on the devices and only acknowledged herself being mentioned with a quick thumbs up. "I really don't like the sound of this," Nia commented, seemingly noticing the tension in the air despite the generally soft tone everyone was taking. She looked at Shada intensely, locking direct eye contact with her as she asked, "I'm guessing James isn't hiding from me right now, and that means if you're here..." Shada bit the inside of her lip. Nia was certainly no less observative than her brother. "You're right," she immediately replied, holding Nia's gaze, wanting to show that she was standing strong in this despite the circumstances. "I'm here with bad news. Very bad news." "And all of this was already going on when you talked to me?" Nia asked a short while later, agitatedly standing up and leaning over the table while banging onto it with both hands. "And he didn't tell me about it?" There was a mixture of anger and hurt in her voice, and her eyes apparently couldn't quite decide between watering and shooting Shada a fiery glare. Shada looked down to the table, her ears hanging. "Things weren't nearly as bad back then," she tried to defend James half-heartedly. "And like I said, the calls were likely all being spied on." "Bullcrap!" Nia replied loudly, pushing herself away from the table and pacing back and forth behind the backs of Kieran and Jaina. "That's not something he can just keep from me. He can just keep from us. What the hell was he thinking?" Shada slightly sank into herself as Nia seemingly let out her entire emotional turmoil without even thinking of something like restraint. Even more confusing was that Kieran and Jaina seemingly just let it happen, basically ignoring Nia as she was pacing up and down and just shooting at Shada with half amused, half apologetic expressions. "Sorry, I don't know, and I couldn't tell you," the feline said, abashedly, sinking even further into her chair as her instincts yelled out to show some resistance being shouted at, while her brain knew that would lead to nothing. Nia stopped dead in her tracks, looking directly at Shada with a single finger outstretched to point at the feline. "I know that. It's not your fault. I'm sorry for yelling, but I'm just so darn wound up right now," she said, clearly making an effort in bringing herself down from a 10 to about a 7. "And you're probably having a hard time with this as well, and here I am yelling at you for nothing. Ugh." Nia stopped again, very deliberately taking a few deep breaths, emphasizing them by lifting her arms along with taking a breath and lowering them while letting the air out again. Once she had finally calmed herself, she lowly mumbled to herself, "Gonna regret that later," before turning around to Kieran, calmly asking, "So, what is the plan from here going forward?"